Well, welcome again to another session of the 15th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. I'm Bob Hales. I'm your moderator. Uh, our session today is What Matters Most? Assessing Values in Higher Education. We have with us Dr. Michelle Blome. Is that right, Michelle?
Yes.
Okay. She is the academic compliance specialist at St. Francis University in lovely Loretto, PA. She has a doctorate from Duquesne, and we were having a great discussion before we started. So I'm interested in what you're going to have to say about values in higher ed. It's all yours, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Bob. So my presentation comes in oftentimes institutions will say, okay, our curriculum instills such and such values. Or you might even have the opposite in the sense of like, our curriculum is specifically trying to cater to people of very different value systems. So um, I think that one of the things that in an age of uh, intense scrutiny over racism and climate change and all of these social justice issues, that it's important to really look at uh, what values we are inculcating in the institution and to uh, learn in a way how to assess them. So assessment is a process of learning that helps us to to do what we do better. I do want to warn you, I do have a PhD in theology, so some of my things are actually borrowed from theology, but I do believe they have secular applications. So because values are important to both religion and in other areas of the world. So all right, so this presentation is going to be set up according to the assessment cycle. So the first stage of the assessment cycle is that stakeholders determine outcomes. You want a diverse range of stakeholders to come together to help to develop your outcomes. And so this is where you're going to be looking at the sources of institutional values. So as your stakeholders are coming together, what values are you placing as objectives? Then you need to align experiences to outcomes. So aligning the curriculum and other learning experience to the values of the institution. It's also important to enact activities and collect evidence. So for that, we're going to be talking about methodologies for measuring value appropriation. And then for analyzing and sharing evidence, drawing significations, we're going to look at, so what is the significance of our assessment for institutional values? And then of course, the final stage is implement and documenting changes. It doesn't make sense to assess anything unless you're actually going to use that data for trying to improve your offerings. All right, so first I want to talk about sources of values. So um, and this I'm borrowing from a theological concept called ressourcement, which is this idea of returning to the sources. But you don't just want to return to the sources in a kind of a uh, automatic, thoughtless way, because some of our sources are in fact, many of them are not uh, we have different perspectives on them today. So for example, you might look at the founding institution mission and vision. And for example, if you belong to a land grant university and your land was granted from somebody else's native territory, that might be something to consider in terms of what your values are going to need to look like. You also want to look at the experiences of stakeholders. So stakeholders have real life experiences in the world. Students, faculty, administration, staff, we all have real life experiences in the world, and those can be foundations for our values. And there's also the common good. So institutions, the primary purpose of an institution of higher education is to offer education, and that is to serve the common good of, whether we talk about the local, the state, the national, or even the international worldview level. We want to develop those circumstances that are the most fitting for people for all persons to be able to gain their fulfillment. All right, so the second area is to align activities to values. So I want to talk about something called that is referred to as symbol in the Catholic tradition, but it's so oftentimes when we think of symbols, they're like, oh, this statue of this saint or this flag or whatever. It's oftentimes seen as a kind of a weak expression of what it is that it's supposed to be symbolizing. So for example, for some people, the American flag is very powerful, but for other persons, it's like, well, it doesn't really reflect my values. So what a symbol is, one way of looking at it is that it establishes being in communion. It establishes us coming together as a community. So for example, there's a difference between saying that, oh, this object represents us, and saying, hey, look, we came together and we did this thing to bring about peace in our community. And so that activity is symbolic. It brought us together as a community. So there's also this idea of real symbol. So it makes present what it signifies. Like a stop sign doesn't itself stop, but if you make a law in the community and the community commits to it, then the sense of what you're doing at a stop sign is that you're making present the reality of the community concern. So it's important when aligning activities to values to be very intentional about it. So you can surface values to people's attention. So oftentimes in an institution, you may have values, but nobody really knows about them. So including those values in what you say, what you do, how you assess as an institution, that can really be a very powerful thing for spreading the word about what your values are and who you want to be. There's also important to collaboratively engage in value acquisition. So if the community is aware that we have values, then we can work together for those values. There's a sense of ownership over the values when, especially when you're not, when you have diverse stakeholder participation in determining what those values are. And then there's also a transparency of values. It's important for students who attend an institution to have a sense of what the institution's values are. It may or may not align with the student's values. For example, some students are vehemently pro-life and some are vehemently pro-choice. And regardless of where you stand on that spectrum, some people, if you're in the medical sciences, you want the values of your program to reflect you. So transparencies of values allows students to be responsible in terms of determining where it is that they want to go. And I don't want to say that they're always going to be as polarized as that particular issue, but you know, there is a sense in which different institutions, for example, even different institutions of the same, like I work at a Catholic university, but even different Catholic institutions have different values. And so one student might feel more comfortable at one university and another student might feel more comfortable at another university. So it's important to be transparent about those values. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is methodologies for measuring value appropriation. And this is kind of like the meat of the presentation. And first I want to talk about the who, what, where, when, why of value appropriation. So who to measure? We want to measure all relevant stakeholders. So there are internal stakeholders in both academic and non-academic units. So if you value, let's say your value system is to help first year college students, or to help Indigenous students, or racial and ethnic minorities. The goals of the institution need to be held not just in the academic departments, but also in the non-academic departments. So it's important to assess both areas. It's also important to assess with external stakeholders. So maybe you're trying to inculcate the value of responsible decision making. You might see where the national place is in responsible decision making, what people in general are, so that you have a comparison point to say, oh, our students are actually emerging from our programs with a greater sense of their responsibility for their actions than the general population of the same age group or demographic range. So what to measure, and this is something that is very close to my heart, in that measuring unity in diversity. So we don't have shared values unless there's a unity among the values. But if we have only unity, then it's ideology. There's no individual contribution to it. So there's also a need for diversity. So what I'm proposing here is that through diversity, we can find unity. One thing, so what I've done is what we can do is measure different domains. So you can measure facility with values, and that would be more cognitive appropriation. So you have to know the values, and you might evaluate commitment to the values, and that's moral and affective appropriation. Both of those are more unity kind of thing. Did they get the value? Can they express the value? Also, though, you need diversity in, and that's what I'm calling an individuating appropriation. That's a term I'm borrowing from Carl Jung, in the sense of it means to become an individual. And part of becoming an individual is being able to express values according to your own life experiences, according to what you know. And so there's not one set. It assumes that there's not one set value that everybody ascribes to in exactly the same way. Like, once you have that, you have an ideology. You don't have a value system. So where to measure? We need safe spaces for value exploration. So we want our students to be able to make mistakes. I was teaching racial justice in a course, and a student had made a reference that was inappropriate, or at least not in line with today's standards of interaction. And so the challenge is to correct the student without making the space a hostile space for them, to challenge them without making them feel like, oh, I really need to be somewhere else, or I'm not going to listen to what you're saying. Now, I do want to clarify that value assessment is not the same thing as value imposition. We're going to be talking about diversity a little bit more in some future slides, but what you don't want to do is say, you believe what I believe, and you have to believe it in the same way that I believe it. Again, that's ideology, that's not values. You also don't want to necessarily equate grading with value acquisition. So if you're let's say you're a Protestant institution and you value a particular way of believing in the Bible, then you don't want to say, I'm gonna grade you poorly, or even I'm going to grade you better because you believe X. That's not going to be a safe space for the students to acquire values, because obviously they know that their grade is dependent on it, and they're going to do what is required. And so that's, again, that just copying something is more ideology than it really is value. So when do we measure? And that's throughout the learning opportunity. So there's formative assessment, which is what you assess while you go along. And it should be value appropriation, or teaching on values should be integrated throughout the curriculum and throughout the institution. So if you value fair play, then in your athletics departments, you should be inculcating those to students. If you value let's say you're serving veteran students, if you value service, then you want to integrate a sense of social responsibility throughout your curriculum. However, we do summative assessment at key symbolic moments. And again, symbolic has to do with when we're coming together as a community, when we make the idea real, when we establish ourselves together in our togetherness. And so key symbolic moments, for example, I know some nursing programs that they will have a pinning ceremony, which is when the nursing students actually pledge themselves to treating their patients according to the ethics of their discipline. So key symbolic moments are great moments to have this sense of assessing, are they actually are they really going to treat their patients according to the values that we have expressed here? Why to measure? And the purpose of assessment is always learning. It's not judgment. So just like you wouldn't say, oh, you've done a bad job because your assessments are not good, you also wouldn't do that for values either. So the purpose of assessment is to develop introspection. And so when you're assessing values, you're developing introspection around the values. It's important also to learn about one's own and one's institutional values. So through assessment, you learn more about what it is that you believe, and your institution as a whole learns more about what it is that they believe as an institution. How to measure. So I'm going to be talking about these a little more in the next slide, but key indicators are levels of cognitive appropriation. So how well do they understand it? Level of commitment, and that's also referred to as the affective domain, which is like value prioritization. Are they really willing to put economic justice above their desire for having extensive wealth? There's also diversity of appropriation, which goes back to that idea of values versus ideology. The key instruments of assessing values, there's pretty much the same thing as with typical assessment: rubrics, focus groups, peer evaluation, questionnaires, especially behavior questionnaires, and portfolios. Now, I wanted to, Bloom's taxonomy is great for the cognitive appropriation of values. I know that there are more advanced systems, and I want to learn those eventually, but right now my familiarity is with Bloom's. So there's a cognitive domain, and I also wanted to point out that there's an affective domain. Some people aren't aware of the affective domain, and the purpose of the affective domain, affective has, that term has to do with like how you receive things in the world. So do you just receive them? Are you responding to it? Are you valuing it? Are you organizing your priorities? Are you internalizing it so that you act out of those values? I refer to these as the dimension of unity, because these types of things you're measuring, does the student understand what we are trying to communicate as our values? Now, the other dimension that is highly important is the dimension of diversity. And what I've done here is I'm borrowing from the psychologist Carl Jung, but in his idea of individuation. But so the first stage is duplicating, which is presenting values, demonstrating values as presented. And then that stage, value acquisition, is ideological. So I'm duplicating your values because I'm believing unquestioningly what you say, or I'm just trying to make you happy. Elucidating is the student is able to expand upon the values presented, either cognitively by adding new thoughts or information, or behaviorally by applying them to new situations. So basically, elucidating is how can we apply these values to some situation that we have not yet seen. Evaluating is that the student critically relates to the values presented by modifying them in light of the student's own experiences of self and community. And this is really like a key stage of this model, because being able to critically relate to values means that you are contributing your own experiences, your own sense of being in the world to developing those values. And so when you're evaluating the values, then you're able to move from ideology to true commitment. I'm holding these because I believe them, and I believe them because I have understood them within my within my framework and within the way that I exist. And the following measure is transforming, and that the student advances critically examines values by changing their own behavioral patterns, leading others interpersonally and changing their behavioral patterns, and or proposing new structures based on those values. So transforming is like a nursing student who is able to develop a procedure of nursing that respects racial justice, or a business student who's able to reimagine business in the light of economic justice, or ecological justice, because we have this trouble with businesses just using the earth instead of using it for advantage instead of actually acting for the common good. So transforming is this level that's the ideal. So we want them not just to pick up the values, but in their own critically examined appropriation of the values, we want them to go out and transform the world. All right, so when drawing significations of institutional values, it's important to begin with an attitude of learning. Again, this is a process of learning. It's not a process of you believe what I believe. So how has the student appropriated the value? And so this has to do with, have they understood what we mean by this value? Have they been able to apply this? But when you ask that, you also need to ask, what does the diversity in their appropriation suggest for re-understanding the institutional value? So as students appropriate values, they're going to be interpreting them within their own interpretive framework. And they're going to be adding their experiences, their thoughts. So as the students are working through these values, they will return to you, or ideally they should return to you, a value system that is kind of looks like what you taught them, but it should also have their own personal stamp on it. And so this is important for, especially if you are in a community that is more ideological, that tends to be more ideological. It's important to try to emphasize that we all appropriate values differently. We don't all have the exact same values, and that it's important that we can come to understand diverse perspectives on these values. So when you understand that the appropriation for the diversity dimension, you can ask, does the diversity establish a new form of unity? And this is where they come together. So the aspect of we don't want so much diversity that we have something entirely different. So for example, if I am talking about ecological justice, then if somebody has this idea of ecological justice that is so far from ecological justice, for example, maybe there's some people on the really extremes who hold some very odd views about ecological justice. If it is too extreme, then it might not establish a new form of unity. So the question is that can the community as a community come together around these diverse expressions? And for many of them, I think that institutions are too cautious, and that we do need to develop through time our values. But then again, there's the other extreme in that you don't want to open the door for whatever value, even if it's completely contrary to a value that you currently hold. It's also, so the second step is to reevaluate institutional values in light of their interpretive progression. So again, as we acquire values and as we live through time, we are going to be addressing and adapting our values to our life experiences, to where the human race is in the world. And so part of this is going back to your institutional values and saying, okay, we've learned things from our students. We've learned things from how they have appropriated our values. How are we then going to incorporate that into our institutional mission and vision? How are we going to say, okay, we are here for you in your needs for this time period? So again, there's this unfortunate kind of in the US, there's this unfortunate kind of pull between conservative and liberal values. But the important thing is to be open to how the values can be expressed differently. All right. So after we interpret values, then we need to close the loop. So how are you going to implement the re-examined value framework? So are you going to share those ideas with faculty and staff and students? Are you going to, how are you going to address reevaluate your own institutional values so that you have an actual action plan? And it's of course important to document and assess changes. This is important for the historical memory of the university. Maybe the university at one time will need to address a resource mall, and they'll need to go back to earlier documents and see, okay, what were the values that we started on? It's also important, of course, for accreditors, for those institutions that are accredited to document and assess those changes. Okay, so I want to thank you for participating. So what questions do you have? I'm also taking concerns, joys, sorrows, and raging debate. I love raging debate. So anybody want to unmute and participate?
On your campus, have you had debates about values?
Yeah, so I don't think it's going on as, so when you do assessment, it should be the actual process becomes systematic so that you ensure that the process is safe and that people feel comfortable in participating in it. There is that process effectively going on our campus in debates between especially diversity and inclusion is a huge issue. Some people are very pro certain types of diversity, other people are against certain types of diversity. So there is this kind of institutional dialogue going on, but unfortunately, I don't know that it's occurring in as uh, uh, well-developed an environment as an assessment environment.
I know institutions often experience trouble when they have guests come to campus to give talk, and some places that what a guest could go to one campus and there'd be this outcry. Go to another campus, hey, it's just a nice talk we're gonna have. Anything,
Yes.
yeah.
So it's important that external stakeholders, when participating in the internal environment, that there is a certain level of alignment of values, in the sense that there's they need to be aware of the values of the institution and to respect those who believe those values, even if they share different values. So it's a matter of respect and not necessarily, oh, you believe what I believe kind of thing. And so I think that if there were an area, a kind of a culture of respecting differences among values, that we wouldn't have as much of an outcry as we do often have these days. Like, oh, why is this university inviting so-and-so, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, I say the best way, if you really disagree with someone coming to your campus to talk, well, one, it may do you good to listen to them. Not that you'll change, but
Yeah,
you'll listen, and maybe you'll pick up some subtleties of what they say, or nobody should show up. It'll
yeah.
be an empty auditorium, which
So
is which will send a message.
even in positions that we disagree with, there usually is some good in them. So usually people have positions because they're trying to protect something. They're trying to protect something that they value and that they hold sacred to themselves, regardless of, so oftentimes, like, this sense of disagreement in values, it's oftentimes because they are trying to protect some value. And so in that, there's always some element of good in the other person's values. And so it's important for us to be able to, in the process of evaluating the diversity of values, to have a sense of, look, what is it that's good in the other person's value? What is it that we might be missing when we might first say, oh, I don't agree? Well, what is it that's part of that value that they're trying to protect? What is that good that they see in the world that they're trying to make sure that it stays precious?
Megan has a good question.
Is it in the chat? Oh,
Yeah, it's in the chat.
okay. What happens if students don't adopt some of the same values as the institution, such as through diversity? Is it seen as a failure in any way? No. So the students will, in some sense, there is an element of common good. So I don't think that that students will emerge from an institution from 4 years of hearing whatever it is that they're hearing and necessarily be unchanged by it. So I don't know that there is that there isn't some element of adoption in some layer or sense. But as I said in one of my slides, assessment is not the same thing as value imposition. We don't want students to say, oh, wait, I believe what you believe, because exactly how you believe or think it, because again, that's a matter of ideology, and it's not a matter of how an individual critical response to it. Like, we're rational human beings, and so we should use our full facilities as rational human beings to engage with questions about, for example, values and the meaning of the significance of what we're doing in the world. So I don't think it's a failure if a student's not like, oh, I believe exactly what you believe. And I also don't think, though, that a student can go through 4 years of an institution and not on some level hold some value in concern. In fact, I oftentimes wonder if I teach a Franciscan Goals for Today course, and I sometimes wonder if some of the students who might struggle in it are struggling because that it might not match their values. And so and that's so I strive to, in that course, I strive to work for common good values such as ecological justice, racial justice, economic justice, these kinds of things that are fairly widely accepted as being good, so that even though they might not be Catholic, or they might not express the same values in the same way I do, that they can still share something with the course that's meaningful. Megan says thanks in
And
the chat.
values for an institution shows up too in the way institutions invest their endowment.
Yes,
Is there,
definitely.
a misalignment with their values and their investment in the coal company in Montana or something?
Exactly. So there's a joke that sometimes the donors comes first and the mission driven reaction comes second. So it is important in assessment for institutions to be asking, are we accepting, especially in the case of donor money, are we accepting this donor money because it really helps to move our mission forward, our values forward, or are we accepting this donor money because it's money, So it's important for the institution to invest their resources and to obtain their resources from areas that are ethically sourced according to their values.
Yeah, that says a lot about an institution if when it comes to a choice like that, do they maintain their values or they just take that money?
Yeah.
And if they do that, then that probably gets everybody questioning the values, the sincerity of the values of
Yes.
the institution.
And it also provides, not only does it provide like questions of, are we being hypocritical, but if the institution isn't actually living up to its values, then ideally people have matriculated to the institution in part to be part of that value system. So if it's ending up being hypocritical, then there's this element that the you might alienate your faculty, your staff, your students from your institution. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen examples of this at other institutions where the board of trustees was like, hey, let's take this donor money or let's build this building, but we can't use it for you. You only have to use it in these ways, and those ways we're not going to say, but they're actually contrary to our values. So the so like it happens, and it happens unfortunately too frequently, that the institution will alienate its own stakeholders by giving in to something that's either contrary to or not quite in alignment with the institution's values.
And in fact, an example is uh, the guy who helped found Fox News, uh,
Oh,
who's dead now.
yeah, I know you're talking about. I just don't know his name.
Anyway, he graduated 10 years before me in the same program,
Oh, wow.
and then donated money for a new newsroom at the university. and they had his name on the wall. And then when, the scandal came about, particularly alumni, but students too said, we don't want his name up there because we don't want to be associated with that. That's not our value.
Yeah,
And having his name is promoting the wrong thing. And his name got taken down. And
yeah,
if he was still alive and asked for his money back, we'd probably give his money back.
that's impressive. That's a very noble thing. I think that well, so part of values acquisition, like I said in one of my slides, is asking, does this new sense of diversity realign with our unity? And if part of your diversity is a far right, very highly troubled individual that doesn't reflect the values of your faculty, your staff, your students, then the question is that can you really form a unity with that type of diversity? And for your institution, the answer was no, that it was so significantly different from your values that that was not an acceptable form of diverse expression.
Well, there you go. Thank you. I have to tell you, this is the best discussion I've had in a long time. I'm I'm glad you did this, just for me personally.
Thank you.
And it's probably not thought about enough by the powers that be at institutions.
Yeah.
They make this, they'll make decisions without asking that question. Okay, does this align with our values?
Yeah, and that's a powerful thing that assessment can add. So assessment, it's when it's done well, it includes a diversity of voices, it includes a diversity of stakeholders. So it's when it's done well, uh, it has voices there that are not typically brought to the table, and so that's why assessment itself, it's I call it a grassroots kind of thing, because like if you're assessing and you're saying, hey, look, this doesn't, and in your reports you say this isn't working, or this isn't happening the way you say that it should be happening, then that's a powerful thing that you can come back and in documenting that, you're documenting the you're putting that as a potential way that the institution can change, can develop in its values.
We've seen this really recently over the past few years, uh, not necessarily universities too. I know what Harvard or Yale, decades ago they got money for buildings, and now they find out, well, this person was a hardcore racist, and really it doesn't align with who we are to have that person's name on that building. Or, communities, cities that have statues of
Yeah.
Confederate generals, you you finally understand that there's more to that statue than just the bronze it's made out of,
Yeah.
uh,
And
and it
that's an
doesn't
important
align.
of aspect of education. So I'm originally from New Orleans, and there's these controversies over moving statues from places to places, and those statues have a very sordid history, but most people don't understand that. So like in the process of education, like, there's a value in teaching the values that are associated with removing those statues and changing the narrative of what American history is and should be. So I do think that that this is that it kind of reinforces why higher education really has a place in values acquisition in the country.
Yeah, you get talking about statues, you get some people that say, well, no, that just is, honoring the hard fought war, in the South. It has no other implication for me. But someone else says, every time I see that, that's a negative symbol for me. Therefore, people have to ask which value really is more important or makes a bigger difference in society.
Yeah, definitely. Um, and there also might seem to be, so if a person is it's I don't think a person who's like, oh, it's just a hunk of bronze would like vehemently object if they take it down. But if somebody has an agenda behind keeping it there, then the question is, so what is it that they are trying to protect? And maybe they're trying to protect something that is problematic, but we can't get to that thing that's problematic unless we start talking and we start working through the values, because there's probably some element of good somewhere in the thing, in the sense of like, I'm trying to protect my own sense of identity or purpose in the world, that kind of thing. Maybe they need to reevaluate their identity or purpose, but the way that you do it is through these challenges, these questions of diversity. Like, how is this value expressed otherwise? Can I express this value in a different way than how I'm insisting upon it in the current moment in time? And that's also important. Like the statue example, it talks about the importance of the cognitive domain of values. So many of those statues were erected long after the Civil War. In fact, they were erected in times of Jim Crow. So most of it is specifically like there's a kind of ignorance about the values that were behind those statues. And so I think that that's partially why the cognitive acquisition of values is just as important as the how you feel about the value or how you want to express it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. I remember that being said before about when the statues generally were erected. Uh, and they, when you get down to it, most of them weren't to honor,
Yeah,
somebody.
they
Uh,
were to establish a
yeah. And values change over time.
yeah,
And people sometimes, I understand change is difficult for everyone. Change is always difficult,
yeah,
to some degree, and it can be uncomfortable. But um, that's, you know, going, you know, going with change is much better than resisting it, being part of the change. You can play a role, but
yeah.
if you simply say, no, that's it, you're more than likely to really get left behind
Yeah,
anyway.
and that's why the idea of symbol is important, this idea of being in community. So it's a discussion for the community as a whole to have. And if you set yourself out of the community, then you're also setting yourself out of the discussion. So the idea may be a terrible one. I mean, there might, like like the example of the newsrooms named after the former Fox guy. So there might be significant problems with it. And so if you set yourself out of the community, oh, I'm not going to go to that school just because of this, then you don't have the chance to say, hey, I'm a student, these are not my values, please remove this.
Yeah. Uh, I love this discussion, but we should go. I got another session coming up. Boy, this has been great, Michelle. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for
And,
having me.
and hopefully you see some of these folks at the next session at the top of the hour.